And that's a wrap on Bands of Mourning. Okay, that was a lot. That was so much. So much happened here. First of all, the book just decided to become Indiana Jones here in the final act, which, bold choice. I think it worked great. I loved the tonal shift from uh, Wild West slash noir vibes that the books that Era 2 has had so far to full on Indiana Jones raiding an ancient temple full of traps to find a magical artifact. I was not expecting it. I'll definitely say that. Um, but I enjoyed it a lot. Um, I enjoy how much Sanderson leans into the pulpiness a bit with Era 2. Uh, I've been reading uh, after I read this, I also read the Allomancer Jack short story in Arcanum Unbounded, and in the postscript for that, Sanderson actually mentions that um, one of the reasons why he didn't want to just write a straightforward pulp story with Allomancer Jack, and why he added the little commentary by his friend, uh, is because Mistborn Era 2 is already essentially his take on that particular subgenre of fantasy. And that's extremely true. Like, Mistborn Era 2 is essentially, if you took all the tropes and all the tonal elements of pulp fantasy from like the 50s and 60s and just played it straight and took it seriously and wrote it with the writing talent of someone like Brandon Sanderson. And it works wonderfully. I enjoy it a lot. It's a much breezier read than something like Stormlight. As a result, however, it's also not as maybe deep or uh, emotionally or thematically compelling as some of the other stuff Sanderson has written. But that doesn't really matter. I'm still having fun. If everything he wrote was like this, I would get tired of it. But because Era 2 is like this counterpart to Stormlight, which is the most serious and like high fantasy thing that he's ever written, I think they work really well as like these parallel series, and I'm glad I'm reading them sort of as I am, like essentially at the same time. I'm glad I did that instead of doing what some people suggest, which was reading Stormlight first and then Era 2, or vice versa. Um, anyway, that's enough about general Era 2 comments now that I've technically finished it, or at least finished everything that's come out so far. Let's talk about what happened here in this particular section. So, I don't know where to begin. I'm going to. Actually, I do know where to begin. I'm going to begin with what I'm not going to talk about here. And what I'm not going to talk about here is the final reveal. Massive spoiler for the end of the book in 3, 2, 1. Kelsier's alive. Somehow. Apparently. I'm not going to talk about that for two reasons. One, I don't know enough to comment because I have no idea how that's possible. I have no idea where Sanderson is going with this story. I don't know. It's an exciting idea, and I'm putting my trust in Sanderson to do something interesting with it. But because it's literally just sort of tossed in there at the end with no additional context, it's just like a cliffhanger reveal, I don't really have any thoughts on it yet. So I won't talk about it here. And the second reason I won't talk about it here is because immediately after recording this, I'm going to go read Mistborn Secret History. And I'm reliably informed that I should save talking about the whole Kelsier being alive thing until after I read that. And by reliably informed, I mean literally Sanderson himself wrote that at the end of Bands of Mourning. Like, in the postscript, he says, like, oh, if you want to know more about what's going on with Kelsier and how he's alive, go read Mistborn Secret History. So I'm going to do that. So I will not be talking about Kelsier past this point anymore. I will say, however, that while I did not, in my wildest dreams, guess that the sovereign of the southern nations was going to end up being Kelsier, I was 100% certain from the get-go that it was not Rashek. It being Rashek would have been such a stupid narrative decision that I trusted Sanderson too much to believe that he would do that. Undoing the death of the Lord Ruler would have been a terrible choice and would have cheapened one of Sanderson's most well-known works in a way that I don't think he would do. So I did not even for a second think that he was going to bring back Rashek somehow. That said, I did have a different theory for who it was going to be as I was reading this, and my guess was that it was going to be Marsh. Because Marsh is the only person we know of, question mark, who could potentially create something like the Bands of Mourning. Because he has full Mistborn powers due to being an Inquisitor, and I don't remember if he also has ferrochemical powers, but he could through hemalurgy. So he has the potential, because he's stuck with 1 billion hemalurgic spikes, to be an equal to the Lord Ruler. But it's not him. It's inexplicably his brother. It's easy to forget, by the way, that Marsh was Kelsier's brother, because Marsh has now been a part of Mistborn for much longer than Kelsier was. So I think of him more when I think of characters in Mistborn than Kelsier. And yet, it's weird to remember that at first Marsh was just kind of like his only role in the story was being the brother of a more important character. Interesting how that works. Anyway, so I don't think I'm going to talk too much about the actual events here because it's a fairly straightforward Indiana Jones story. They go to the place where Mr. Suit and his people are keeping all their stuff. They find an airship, that's got some implications for the future. Can't wait to read book 4. Hurry up, Brandon. Really want to read that now. Because I love airships. Anyway, yeah, they find the airship. They find Alec, a guy from. I think the implication is that Alec's people are the ones who Rashek placed on the southern pole of Scadrial when he remade the world. I think that's what I'm supposed to take away from this. I believe he called them a control group or something. There was a phrasing like that at one point in the original Mistborn trilogy. Like, he didn't alter them biologically the way he altered the northern people, the people of the Final Empire. But anyway, he's an interesting new character. I like Alec a lot, even though I still don't quite understand. I need to learn more about his culture before I can fully understand the implications of the way he talks to Wax. So, at first, I was under the impression that his society like worships metalborn people to an absurd degree, and that they like bow down before them at all times. And that still might be the case, but if that's the case, then Alec is a highly unusual member of his culture, because Alec is a disrespectful little shit to Wax. He is constantly sarcastic. He constantly does barely veiled insults, and it is very clear that he does not have this reverence for Wax that his words at first implied. Um, so either there's more to his culture's relationship with the Metalborn than we've seen so far, or he is just a very rebellious member of his culture, and either would be interesting. I hope we get to see more of Alec in the next book, and I'm sure we will, because he's clearly being set up as the romantic interest of Marasi. Which, by the way, since I'm on the topic, I talked very recently in one of, well, not very recently for you, but very recently for me, I think, in one of the Words of Radiance videos, I talked about how Sanderson has this, in my opinion, slightly uncomfortable thing going on in his work with age gaps between characters in romantic relationships. And the thing that I'm uncomfortable with there is not so much the age gaps as the fact that they are consistently in one direction, meaning that there are almost always older men in relationships with younger women in all of his works. And I realized while reading this that Mistborn Era 2 is a bit of an exception to that. Steris is technically younger than Wax, but she's very much a full-grown adult, and she's also more mature than him in many ways. So I don't think so. That I mean, while that does fit the pattern, it's not an egregious one in any way. But the other two main characters of this story, Wayne and Marasi, are both now paired up with characters where the age gap goes the other way. Marasi is apparently going to be involved with a younger man because Alec is 21 or something. He's definitely younger than Marasi. She even calls him a child at the end, I think. And Wayne is involved with Milan, who is... That might be the single largest age gap between any two characters in all the Cosmere, because Milan is 500 years old. But yeah, be that as it may, yeah, there's now two of the three central romances of Era 2 are apparently going to be ones where with younger men and older women, which, like I said, I'm happy to see that particular pattern at least get diversified a bit. Anyway, where was I? Yes, Alec. So Alec introduces a whole host of world building stuff that is really interesting for the future. And some of it, based on the information we have right now, doesn't quite fit into the magical system of Scadrial as it's been established. In particular, the grenades, the little cubes that can take your allomancy and hold it and then release it. I don't think that within the rule set that we currently know, there is a logical explanation for the existence of those objects. I trust Sanderson to have one. I'm sure he's not going to just say a wizard did it, because he never does. But as of right now, those I think are fairly unexplained. Et metal is something that is currently unexplained, but it's also explicitly a new kind of metal that hasn't been seen before, so that could be anything. He's free to make up whatever rules he wants with how Et metal works, and we also don't know if Et metal is even an allomantically active metal. We don't know if you can actually burn Et metal or make a metal mind out of it. All we know is that Et metal is is a power source. And I also don't know if it's going to end up being a real metal, such as lithium, because that's a metal that explodes in water, and so does sodium. I don't know if it's going to end up being a real metal like those, or if it's going to be maybe et metal is the weird red metal that's associated with Trell. Maybe. We've only seen et metal in like an active glowing state, so maybe if we ever saw it deactivated, it would look like the spike that Bleeder had. Something to think about. So yeah, et metal I'm not sure about. And the third thing is the weird metal mines. Now the weird metal mines, at first, my thought was, oh, those also don't seem to make a lot of sense. But they actually make a ton of sense. Because they're just regular metal mines. There's no rule that says a metal mine has to be a bracelet. It just has to be metal that's in contact with your skin, as far as I know. So it actually makes a lot of sense that these work the way they do. Now, the limitation of only being able to use one at a time, I feel like that's probably a rule that's being established for how how metal mines that store investiture work, which is that you can only have one active at a time. I'm trying to remember if copper mines worked the same in the original trilogy. I'm trying to remember. Could Sazed use wear two different copper mines at the same time and have access to the memories in both? I think not. I think he might have had to swap them out. So it's possible that that's just how metal mines work in general, that only one of a kind can be used at a time. And since all of these southern metal mines are fundamentally investiture metal mines, even though they also have other stuff in them, that means that they're incompatible with each other. So that makes sense. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting to me here is the way connection works. So what we find out here is that a connection metal mine, so a metal mine that stores connection, allows you to establish a connection not between yourself and other people. Because like the way it's described in the Ars Arcanum kind of implies that connection just makes it easier to get people to like you. But what Alec implies is that the connection in the word connection metal mind is not connection with other people, it's connection with the land you happen to be in at the time. And the metal mind rewrites your soul's history, is I believe the phrasing used, so that you were always from that land and therefore know the language. Which is interesting because that's an answer to a question I didn't ask. Because when he put on a metal mind and just suddenly knew the language, I just assumed that was a copper mind that contained knowledge of the language, but apparently not. Which does make some sense because where would their people have knowledge of the language? Well, I guess from Kelsier. Now that we know about that. Anyway, yeah, connection is weird, but more importantly, connection sounds like soul forging from the Emperor's Soul short story, novella thing. I'm not gonna get too into spoilers for the Emperor's Soul, but the magic system in that story is fundamentally about rewriting the history of things so that they have always been something else. And the phrasing here, that a connection metal mind rewrites the history of your soul, is really interesting. That's a really interesting phrase. That makes me think of that. And this is the second time recently that I've noticed a connection between like a similarity between the magic systems of different worlds. So I think that as we go on, we're going to realize that that these seemingly disparate magic systems in the Cosmere have a lot more in common than we've thought. And that makes sense, since they're all fundamentally based on investiture, and they all fundamentally work with the same three realms: the physical, cognitive, and spiritual realms. So it makes sense that there would be similarities. Anyway, I don't want to get too much further into the weeds with these theories. I'm just going to say that I'm beginning to get a feeling for how this story is going to go interstellar. Like, I think my current theory, which obviously no one can confirm except Brandon himself, as of now, is that the way that the Mistborn series is going to end up going interstellar is that some of these new combinations of these new tricks of allomancy and feruchemy that have been discovered here are going to be extremely useful for achieving FTL travel. In particular, I'm thinking if you could get some kind of trick using the temporal metals, so Wayne's elementic ability and Merassi's elementic ability. I forget which metals those are, but if you could get some kind of weird combination of those two abilities working in a really specific way using one of these elementic grenades, that could be maybe used to simulate FTL travel. I'm not a physicist, I don't know, but I have a feeling that those metals, the temporal metals, are going to play a pretty significant role in how we get space travel. In Era 4, I guess. Okay, moving on from that. The culture of the South, as expressed through Alec, is something that I really, really enjoyed learning about because it was so reminiscent of learning about the Shan-Chan in Wheel of Time, which was my favorite part of the Wheel of Time. I am a huge fan of the Shan-Chan. They're maybe my favorite part of, I mean, not fan, I hate them, but they're my favorite part of the books. I really enjoy reading about them. And you can really see some of the influence here because it's, at least I think that this particular culture and the way it is described and introduced to us probably wouldn't exist without the Shan-Chan. It's a very different culture. It has almost nothing in common, but there's like the way it's presented feels similar to me. And the way the cultures interact. It's something that very few fantasy authors get right, in my opinion. But Jordan was one of them, and Sanderson is another. So, this culture, we don't learn anything overtly disturbing about this culture. Anything super disturbing. Like, we learn they worship allomancers, which is a bit uncomfortable, but I mean, it makes sense given that they apparently have very few of them, and also that they literally rely on them to survive. So it makes perfect sense. What is more interesting, however, is that I feel like there's an implication of a darker side to this culture. So, in particular, there is a mention of the fire mothers and the fire fathers who are used to create the heat metal mines. And there's also mention of something called excisors, which are used to create those. And these two things, to me, seem to imply that certain kinds of feruchemists and or allomancers are harvested with perhaps dubious consent down south. And I talked about this at the beginning of the book, actually. I talked about how the introduction of the idea of investiture and identity metal mines, i.e. ones that, like the fact that it would theoretically be possible to give metal-born powers to someone who isn't metal-born by taking them from someone else, and not through hemalurgy, but through this other process. How that has some potentially dark implications for where that could go in a society. And I'm beginning to suspect that when we learn more about this southern culture, which I'm sure will happen in the fourth book, we're going to find out that those horrific implications are actually enacted in that culture, at least some of them. Okay, I've gone long enough without talking about the actual big plot things that happen here, the character moments and stuff like that. So let's talk about Wayne, Steris, Marasi, and Wax. Milan doesn't really get a big character moment here, in my opinion, and I've already talked about Alec. But let's start with my current favorite character in Mistborn Era 2, which is Steris. Steris continues to be lovely. I have nothing but praise for the way she's written. I enjoy every single scene with her. And the wedding at the end in any other story would have felt super cheesy. Like ending a book on a wedding is like the cheesiest, most generic cliche way to end a book. And Brandon has done it before once. I'm not gonna say in which book to avoid spoilers. And when he did it before, it didn't work for me. It felt cliche. But here, in part because of the pulpy cliche nature of this story, and in part because it's something that made Steris so happy, and I want Steris to be happy, I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm glad that's how this book ended. So that's all I have to say about Steris. Wax doesn't have a ton of development in this book, in my opinion. Sazed implies that Wax's arc in this book was about learning to love himself, question mark? Like, learning to not be filled with, like, self-loathing or loathing for his line of work or something. And I don't buy that, personally. Like, I'm gonna be honest, I don't think, if that's what Sanderson was going for, these 3 previous books with Wax, that is not the impression I got. I got the impression of a guy who is perfectly happy with his profession, and who doesn't really have a lot of self-loathing to go around. Like he felt some guilt about Leslie's death and stuff, but that was not a dominant aspect of his personality whatsoever. Like, if Sazed had given that speech to Wayne, I would have been like, oh, that makes sense. That's a good way. That works with Wayne's character. But no, he gave it to Wax, and I was like, what? But I feel like Wax is a bit undercooked as a protagonist anyway. Like, the appeal of these books, for me as a very character-focused reader sometimes, is definitely not Wax. I'm here for Steris and Wayne, largely. And speaking of characters who don't really have a ton of development, in my opinion, Marasi. So Marasi's arc throughout the trilogy so far has been better established than Wax's. Like, I was not surprised when her story at the end was about learning to stop putting herself in Wax's shadow and stop comparing herself to Wax. That makes a ton of sense for Marasi. It's just not super interesting, in my opinion. Marasi is a character who I really enjoyed in the first book, and then she became a cop and therefore boring. I mean, it's really that simple. Like, Marasi just is no longer a character I'm very interested in since book 2. There's a bit of promise at the end here. There's a promise that she is going to kind of maybe become this era's Sazed. Like, she's the one who's going to do a bunch of research and discover the truth about what's going on. That would be interesting. But as of right now, Marasi is not a character I'm super invested in. In general, Era 2 is not a super character driven story in my opinion compared to some to other Sanderson stuff. I could be wrong. Maybe it's the same as Era 1 and I'm just spoiled by Stormlight now, which is super character driven. I don't know. Um anyway, Wayne continues to be the most developed character here. Wayne is a super interesting character. I love him overcoming his guns thing enough to shoot Telsin, but not enough to actually kill her. Um, oh yeah, I didn't talk about Telsin, by the way. I don't really have much to say. Telsin is a super underdeveloped character too. Uh, and I also literally called that she would betray Wax the second she appeared on screen. Like, her betrayal was incredibly predictable, which isn't a criticism, because again, this is very much intended to be an homage to classic Indiana Jones type stories. But it was super predictable, and I don't know if I was supposed to be surprised by the reveal that she's evil, but I wasn't. Um, I was just like, yeah, that makes sense. Of course she's evil. Uh, but also, like I said, she's just not the most developed character. I feel like we could have done a few more flashbacks of her like youth with Wax before the reveal that she's evil. Um, to like really set her up as a character. Because as of right now, there's really no way to know how or why she started working with the set. She has a cool name though, Lady Sequence. That's a really cool title. Um, anyway, I was talking about a different character, wasn't I? Yes, Wayne. Uh, Wayne is great. I think one of the best scenes in this book is him looking at Wax as Wax is dying and saying, I can't do this without you. And Wax saying, yes, you can. And Wayne says, no, I don't mean this, what we're doing right now. I mean life. That was a really good line and also really sad. And apparently there are some people who don't like Wayne as a character. And I can see why, but I really enjoy him. And I feel like he has more depth than anyone else here, except maybe Steris. Um, and I'm hoping that Steris and Wayne will become better friends in the next book, because right now they're at each other's throats all the time, and I don't think they need to be. I feel like they could be great friends if they just stopped thinking the worst of each other. Because they're actually way more similar than either of them would like to think. Like, Wayne has way more Steris in him, and Steris has way more Wayne in her than they would like to think. Um, the other thing that I really liked here at the ending is uh, there's a moment when Marasi has the power of the bands. She has the full powers of the Lord Ruler, and she feels them coursing through her, and she immediately decides to give them up. And one of the things she says in her mind when she's giving them up is something along the lines of, I'm not the Ascendant Warrior. And I feel like that reference to Vin is very purposeful, because I feel like the reason Marasi gives the bands up is because she realized in that moment of holding so much power, she realized the thing that Vin took like 2 whole books of being Mistborn to realize, which is that having that kind of power that no one else has can very easily make you dehumanize others, can very easily make you think you're above everyone else. Essentially, the reason Marasi gave away the bands, in my opinion, is because she became aware of the reasons why Vin slaughtered hundreds of Set's men in the second book, if that makes sense. Like I talked about that way back then when I was reading Era 1, but there was a big theme in Era 1 around Vin and Kelsier both essentially viewing themselves as like having the right to do things because they are Mistborn that normal people don't have the right to do. Like they viewed themselves as more worthy, even though they would never admit it to themselves that that's how they felt. Um, and I feel like that's kind of what this is playing on. Like Marasi kind of realized that this power can easily lead to that. Um, I'm not sure why Wax gave them up so easily. I don't know. I mean personally I don't really agree with Marasi, by the way. Like if you gave me godlike power, I would use it to change the world for the better, in my opinion. And if my opinion turns out to be wrong, well, to hell with it. I still have to do it. I would feel a moral obligation to use that power for the betterment of the world. And I'm kind of surprised that Marasi doesn't, especially because in the book earlier, Marasi actually says at one point, Wax wants to catch the bad guys. I want to make a new world in which there's no need for people like Wax. And I feel like you kind of could have used some of that godlike power to maybe do that, but I do understand, like I said, I do understand what Brandon is going for here. And also, she probably couldn't have used it, I guess, because it was very limited, like it ran out fairly quickly. Um, yeah. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that whole like final scene. And the last thing I want to talk about is Trell. So Trell has now been explicitly depicted by Harmony Sazed as a red glow that is encroaching on Scadrial from space, from outer space, and threatening the existence of Scadrial. And Trell has servants whose eyes glow red, and those servants have now decided to destroy Scadrial. And Trell might be Odium, is my current theory. I don't know how I'd feel if I was right. I don't know if I want to be right. But my current theory is that Trell is somehow Odium. Um, Whether that makes sense, I don't know, because I don't know the chronology. I don't know if Mistborn Era 2 takes place before or after Stormlight. But I think it's not unlikely that Trell is Odium. It could be something else entirely. It could be a brand new thing. It could, like, there's not necessarily any reason to think that Trell is a shard, aside from the fact that every other godlike being in the Cosmere so far has been a shard. Um, so I don't know. Maybe we're about to be introduced to the concept of non-shard gods. That's possible, or it's a shard we haven't seen before or heard of before. But the red eyes really, really make me think that this might be Odium. Um, which again, depending on where this is set in the timeline compared to Stormlight, may or may not work. Maybe this is something. Maybe Mistborn Era 2 is going to end up being the story of something Odium did before ever going to Roshar, or like before killing what's his face. I don't know. Um, and again, this is all speculation. I could be completely wrong. I'm just putting it out there that my current theory is that. Uh, and the last thing I'll say is that I'm really fine with Edwarn dying, Mr. Suit, because he wasn't a very interesting villain. And I'm hoping that Telfin will be more interesting as a primary villain once we get some development for her and hear about why she joined the set. Because as of right now, uh, we only had Edwarn, and Edwarn's motivations for joining the set are just, I am evil and want power and money. Ha ha ha. And that's a boring motivation for a villain to have. It's a very realistic one. Most evil people in the world have that motivation, but I don't think it's a very interesting motivation for a fantasy villain. So I'm hoping that Telsin is maybe a more nuanced character. Hopefully, maybe. We'll see. Um, anyway, I could talk for hours about the implications of the world building of the Southern cultures and what that's going to do for the future, but I'm not going to, because by the end of this year, we'll get the fourth book, and then I'll probably have a more complete picture of that culture, because right now I only have like a second-hand weird account that is very incomplete. Um, so I'm going to go read Mistborn Secret History now, and then I will be back here to talk about the 3 Mistborn stories in Arcanum Unbounded. Um, Mostly probably Secret History, because I don't have much to say about the first 2, which I've already read. Um, and then I'll be back for that. And then after that, we are finally getting back to Roshar with Edge Dancer, which I'm looking forward to a great deal. So, uh, see you next time for all that stuff that I just listed. Bye.